All right, everyone, welcome to another excellent episode of the Because Football podcast. This is your host, Coach Andrew, and today we've got an awesome guest, Maher Mezahi. Maher is a Algerian football journalist based in Algiers, Algeria. He's covered North African football extensively. He's had his work published in publications such as the BBC, Guardian, the Telegraph, ESPN Africa, and Al Jazeera English. Maher, on the eve of, or almost on the eve of AFCON, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a pleasure being on the Because Football podcast. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, first thing here, I like to go with each guest on a personal note. Like, what are some of your earliest experience of playing football, of experiencing it? Like when you go all the way back, kind of where did it all start for you?
Yeah, so I was born in Detroit. I grew up in Canada and in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And so my earliest memories are actually just playing football there in Windsor. Like district leagues, and then travel teams. We have, I think, a similar setup to a lot of clubs in the States.
Sure.
Um, we actually on Windsor, it's a border city with Detroit. So we would actually in the fall, I think fall or spring, I think in the fall we would go play in the Michigan League against, like some of the bigger teams like Vardar over there or Michigan
Yeah.
Metro Stars and
Okay.
Waza. So I was always very involved in playing the game. But then even in my family, my grandfather was one of the first international referees in Algeria. He actually refereed the 1965 African Cup of Nations
Wow,
third
that's
place
dope.
match, a few Algerian Cup matches. Yeah, so he was one person that, he was always in Algeria, I was always in Canada, and sort of have a real relationship or have a bond. We sort of bonded over football a lot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Man, that's awesome. That's like so you've really got a personal connection to AFCON now. We're here, quite a ways down the road, but that's amazing. At a young age, like I'm sure, you're watching kind of football from all over, but who do you remember as being some of your earliest like heroes and people that really players, coaches, specific like teams and eras of teams that like really helped you fall in love with the game?
Yeah, the 1998 World Cup was the first real big competition that I can remember. I was 7 years old at the time. And I remember my parents like pulling me into the living room and showing me Zinedine Zidane and being like, hey, he's Algerian. And I just didn't care
Yes.
that much because I saw Emmanuel Petit. He had a beautiful ponytail. I liked his style. He had like a cool bracelet on. And he was the player that I was like, oh, I like this guy. And I asked my brother, who does he play for? He told me France and Arsenal. I was like, okay. So Arsenal immediately became my team. And Petit, I think, only stayed for a year or two. And I started watching Arsenal. And it was actually Thierry Henry that ended up keeping my love for
I
Arsenal
have to
going
be.
for a
Yeah.
long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was really who I really enjoyed watching growing up until the 2006 World Cup when it actually became Zinedine Zidane again on that last, World Cup run that he had that was so magical. So those were some of my first, inspirations when watching football. It wasn't really until later in life, maybe as I became a teenager, I was in high school, that I started really paying attention to African football on a real level.
Okay. Okay. And then when did things kind of shift for you for like, hey, I think I'm so crazy about this game that we need to jump in, head first. And when did you start really formally writing, reporting, and getting involved with telling stories around the game?
Yeah, honestly, I remember it was an afternoon at my aunt's house. She's obviously also Algerian, my mom's sister. I was by myself in the basement, had the remote, just flipping through the channels, and I go through the Algeria channel. It was a satellite, and there's a match Algeria against Cape Verde. This was in 2006 or 2007, and there were 55,000 people in the stands, and Algeria scored, and I just saw flares everywhere,
Mm,
and it really drew me in. I said, that's something that I find interesting, exciting, and this is something that I want to get into and be involved with. And immediately I started following the Algerian national team very, very closely. And this is also around the same time when the internet's starting to take off and we're getting, statistics on websites, and it made it easier to follow these different leagues. Legal or illegal streaming became a thing.
yeah. Whatever you got to do, you're a fan, man. It wasn't,
Yeah,
it's not like
so
you're running
so
another business.
that's
We're just being fans here. Yeah.
I remember like being in high school and then finishing my work and grabbing a spare piece of paper and just started drawing up formations and what could, the under 23 Algeria team look like? What could, and slowly my love for African football grew out of a love for Algerian football. and then North African football, and now it's just a continental thing. So that's really how it was, the seeing that match to Algeria Cape Verde, and then the advent of the internet and
Yeah.
finding, all these different Algerian players playing in so many different European leagues that really drew me in.
That's awesome. You can kind of pinpoint the moment, right? Like you kind of remember when
Yeah, yeah.
that spark really just lit, just like the flares in the stadium. So that's awesome. Looking forward now, obviously it's like a massive time for African football with AFCON, right at our doorstep here. Like for people who might not know or be that well versed and that familiar with African football, like what would you say makes AFCON unique compared to the World Cup, the Asian Cup, which is going to be running at the same time, like the Euros, Copa America, we have the Gold Cup and CONCACAF. Like what does AFCON have to offer the world of football, like uniquely, that other competitions just can't compete with?
Yeah, I think the cliche answer here is colorful fans, spectacular goals,
Mm-hmm.
poor but entertaining officiating, and it's true that these are all aspects that sometimes can make up, the entertainment factor of an African Cup of Nations. Um, Me personally, what I love about the African Cup of Nations is that it brings together 54 countries into a single place for a month's time. And there's a cultural exchange that happens between Africans that I don't think happens, at any other time, at any other place.
Mm.
And it happens on a very real level. And so, where else am I going to speak to? Me as an Algerian from somebody from Mozambique or from Angola. There's a player that from Egypt. His name is Shikabella. He plays for Zamalek. His real name is Mahmoud Abdelrazak Hassan, but they call him Shikabella because in 1990 there was a Zambian forward named Webster Chikabala that played really well in the Africa Cup of Nations. And so you
Wow.
see like, yeah, there's like these, a Zambian and an Egyptian. Again,
Yeah,
no
yeah, the
like
borrowing, right?
language connections, no religious, no ethnic, but there's a real exchange that happens. And I think that's really one of my favorite things about the African Cup of Nations. And I think that's what makes it special.
Yeah, for sure. When you
Just
think of,
one more thing. Sorry.
yeah,
There's
please.
also very human stories. Like in a period of time where football has become really sanitized and corporate and sometimes, too big for its britches. Um, some of the stories that you can get out of an AFCON, are still very human. Some of these players are very, very humble. You still have access to players. Um, and they're connectable. You can feel like this person's just like me. It's not
For
there are some
sure.
exceptions to the rule. Mohamed Salah from Liverpool is one of those exceptions where he feels like a conglomerate, a business conglomerate. He doesn't really feel like a human being at times because he's so unattainable and because there are so many there's his entourage around him is so big and so
Yeah. And
impenetrable.
the status he
But
has, right? His role
yeah,
for that country.
100%.
Like he can't be a normal person, right? Like
Yeah,
the
it's
status he's
practically
at.
impossible.
Yeah.
But by and large, I think most people, even some of the stars that you would think are should be at that level, are usually attainable and you can connect with them on a human level.
Yeah. And speaking of those human stories, could you maybe give us one to keep an eye out for in this version of the AFCON? Like anything kind of that you're looking for, obviously beyond the goals, beyond the officiating, behind the kits and the fans in the stadium, like anything that fans, should care about or could maybe keep an eye peeled for.
What I'm really looking forward to is going to the north of the Ivory Coast because in the middle of the 2000s, the Ivory Coast was split into
Mm-hmm.
the Christian south and the Muslim north. And they were really on the brink of a civil war. There were rebel-held territories in the north and Christian-held or state-held territories in the south.
Sure.
And so it was split along ethno-religious lines, and that was a real big problem. And it was really going to descend into a bloodbath. And what happens is the Ivorian national team, which is so popular, like all African national teams are in their countries, they first of all are on the back of three consecutive horrific showings at the AFCON in 2000, 2002, and then 2004 they didn't even qualify.
Mm.
But at the same time, they're on the brink of qualifying for the 2006 World Cup for the very first time. And this is, the Didier Drogba, Didier Zokora, Bonaventure
Yeah.
Kalou, Bakary Kone. It's that generation. And what Didier Drogba does is after their final qualifying match in Sudan, where they qualified at the very last minute because Cameroon missed a penalty kick in the last minute, again, in another match against Egypt. He's in Sudan. He grabs a microphone, he grabs a television camera, and he puts out a plea to the Ivorian people to lay down their arms and to come together. And that plea is televised and it goes on the news for every day on a loop for 3 months, 3 to 6 months, he told me.
Mm.
And so that's just like a moment that, means more than football, and later
100%.
on he wins the African Ballon d'Or just 6 months later, and he makes it a point to go up to the Muslim North, rebel-held North, and to present it to the people over there. And a few months later, he's the one that goes to the federation and says, let's play a friendly match up there against Madagascar, in which they win 5-0. And so I want to go to the North now. And the stadium there in Bouaké is called Stadium of Peace and Reconciliation.
Mm.
And I just want to go and speak to people and see how football managed to transcend politics and the ugly part of life, and how football managed to mend those bridges. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to.
That's amazing. I've heard obviously the cliff notes of that story, right? I've heard like, oh yeah, Drogba stopped the civil war, like that, but I didn't understand kind of like the nuance of details of that, and that's something that didn't really without knowing the details of like the conflict at the time and the different social and religious dynamics, like just didn't know that. So I'm sure we'll definitely keep our eyes open for your reports on that. I'll be more in Abidjan and Yamoussoukro, but when you're up in Bouaké, we wish you the best and really get to experience a place that probably doesn't get to experience too much of that top level football. So I'm sure the people there are just going to be absolutely pumped and very ready for that. Amazing. In terms of like now on the field, we know some of the bigger teams, that have traditionally been strong, like Egypt, the record title holder, Senegal, defending champions, Morocco with their performances in the World Cup. Who should people keep an eye out for as far as some of like not only the favorites, but some teams that could really sneak in and surprise?
Yeah, honestly, I think you hit the favorites on the head. For me, it's going to be Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire because they're hosts and because on paper, I think they're the deepest, most talented squad. Senegal are practically right there with them, and they're also the defending champions, and they have a lot of experience. Um, Egypt, I think, also very experienced. They know who their best players are, and their forward line is in fantastic form. And finally, who's the last name that I'm missing out? Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. Those are the four, I think.
Okay.
And Morocco, if I didn't speak about them, was the World Cup performance and carrying that
Yep, for
momentum
sure.
with their great coach into this tournament. So those are my four favorites, my out and out favorites. These are teams that expect to be in the semifinals. A quarterfinal berth would be a disappointment for them. As for dark horses, I think not many people are expecting much out of Algeria this time around, and something feels right about them. Unlike other teams, they didn't go to Dubai or to Paris or wherever to prepare for this tournament. They went to Togo in Lomé, in the
Mm.
heat and the humidity. They played tough, friendly matches against Togolese sides and Burundi and sides that don't necessarily want to play football. So I think they did the preparation really, really well. Excuse me. And morale is high in the camp. So 2 months ago, if you asked me about Algeria, I would have been pessimistic.
Mm.
For some reason, I don't know if it's just because the tournament's approaching and I'm being biased and that supporters getting in me, but rationally, it feels like there's something special happening there. Other than that, your perennial dark horses are Burkina Faso and Mali. Mali have the deepest midfield. I think one of the deepest midfields in world football. Player, excuse me, sorry.
All good.
Players like
All
Yves
good.
Bissouma from Spurs, Hamid Kamara from Monaco, Amadou Haidara, Diadje Samaseku, Lassana Coulibaly, Aliou Dieng. These are all, some of them you might not have heard of, but they're all incredibly solid, reliable, dependable ball winners in midfield. And so they're very difficult to play against. And Burkina Faso, similar in that you might not have heard of some of their players, especially in midfield,
Mm-hmm.
players like Gustavo Singare or Ibrahim Blati Toure. But these players have a lot of experience in the AFCON and they often make your superstars look bad. They'll play in very weird leagues at times, but they have young, talented players like Bournemouth's Dango Ouattara, uh, Manchester City's, but currently on loan at Luton Town, Issa Kabore, Edmund
Mm-hmm.
Tapsoba, Bayer Leverkusen, Adamo Nagalo, who's currently at Nordsjælland. These are all players that have really good talent that could play in the Champions League, and some of them do play in the Champions League. But then it's also their underrated players that people don't really account for that end up making life very difficult. And Burkina Faso have also been to two semifinals in the last three AFCON, so they're definitely a team to look out for too.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't realize that they performed that well in the last few versions, and I think there's something to be said in these major tournaments of just the magic of who is going to kind of show up. So like Morocco did in the World Cup, right? It's like who's going to do that now on the AFCON stage. Um, Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how things play out. I hope for the host Cote d'Ivoire, for the feeling, for the atmosphere of the tournament, that they do well, but also can recognize that having that home support is great, but maybe it can sometimes tip, the pressure can tip over. So I'll be interested to see how they do, because now you're the second person who's kind of mentioned them as, sure, they haven't had as strong of showings the last few years, but it seems to be hitting at the right time, and then having the advantage of being at home could really be helpful for them. In terms of like kind of the knock-on effects of AFCON, right? We look at Ivory Coast is saying this is going to be the best prepared, the best organized, the most secure AFCON of hospitality. So, and I'm seeing like the videos of pictures of the new stadiums and the investment and things like that. So if we want to look again at those kind of human stories in a couple of years time, like how would you maybe compare this and the buzz, the anticipation for this AFCON versus some of the previous versions? And like what like are we really going to see, what is being on offer? Of course, we won't know until it happens, but how does this kind of match up with previous versions and the lead up and kind of the buzz for the tournament?
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with Cote d'Ivoire and Abidjan in particular, the capital city, it's probably one of the nicer cities in West Africa. A lot of amenities available. You can have your fast food, your Western fast food chains. There were at certain times, up to 30,000 French people living in Abidjan, for example. Lots of Lebanese. It's very cosmopolitan, multicultural, lots of great amenities. It's really, really a calm, cool, peaceful place with a lot of great facilities. Um, if we're comparing it to previous AFCONs, look, I've been to three before. Gabon, I felt like was a country that still had to build a lot of infrastructure, especially outside of the capital of Libreville. And so at times it felt like structure infrastructure was lacking, and that was a strain on us when we try to do our work as journalists. Egypt, I don't think we can compare to any of them because it's a top five economy and it's 120 million people. And I was mostly staying in Cairo. In Cairo, I mean, I've only been to New York for 12 hours in my life, but I think it's probably the closest thing we can get. It's just a city that never sleeps and
Right.
you can do anything, anytime, anywhere. Everything is possible. Um, but Cameroon, I think, was probably the most disorganized country in terms of hosting the AFCON. Everybody was complaining about organization and logistics, and it just wasn't very simple to do our work. But these are things that, when you cover an AFCON, it's sort of part and parcel of it. It's not something that you're going into sort of expecting everything to be a breeze. And if it were a breeze, I think it would take away some of the sweetness of the struggle. I
For
don't mind,
sure.
like struggling to find transportation, finally finding somebody, striking up a discussion. These are otherwise we would just go to Champions League matches in the Camp Nou
Exactly.
and Emirates Stadium every week. But for me, some of the best parts of the AFCON are, going through a little bit of struggle and difficulty and overcoming it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Great context, I think, for myself, for our viewers too, to see, because everyone's always going to talk it up, right? The organizers are going to say, the people who have planned it, they're always going to say that this is going to be the best tournament and everything. So to
Yeah,
hear
yeah,
that,
yeah.
it's like we'll see, we'll see, but it sounds like it could be on point. But then another thing I wonder about, this topic came a lot with the Qatar World Cup, with even South Africa, with the Brazil World Cup. We've seen it is, so all this investment is made in the infrastructure. And I think as far as like, your roads improving, airports improving, transportation, like those are generally investments that will be sustained as long as there's the political and financial ability to do so. But then when it comes to the stadiums, right? We talked about Qatar building all these massive stadiums, and now what are they doing? And then in Brazil, similar situation. We see like years later now. Could you talk a little bit about like some of the positives and then some of the drawbacks of a host country of a major sporting event like this?
Yeah, for sure. So Gabon is the best example for me because yes, they need a big stadium in the capital of Libreville, but it's just a country of a couple million people. Do they really need, a 40,000 seater in Franceville, which is all the way east, an 8 hour car ride, in the middle of the equator, the equatorial jungle, really, in Africa? Do they really need one in OEM in particular? OEM is the same thing. It's even worse than Franceville. It's smaller. It's in the middle of the jungle, and that has become a white elephant. There are, trees and vegetation sprouting on the running track there. And it was a very expensive, structure to build. At times, there are sometimes diplomatic trade-offs that are used to build these stadiums. China sometimes will build these stadiums, sometimes for free to build up goodwill with governments, to strike
Hmm.
up business deals after. It's called stadium diplomacy, Chinese stadium diplomacy on the African continent. It's something you can read about if you type it into Google. Um, but for the Ivory Coast, um, I think there's only one stadium that might be unnecessary, and that's the newest one. It's in Ebimpe, which is an hour away from Abidjan in the suburbs, and it's huge. And I just wonder, is it absolutely necessary? You really need one national stadium in Abidjan, and you have
Hmm.
one at the Stade Félix Houphouët-Boigny. Um, that's really like the main historic stadium. I think if
Right.
you could just revamp that, that was for me the one that's necessary. I don't think you need two. And the other one that you really don't need probably is Yamoussoukro, because Yamoussoukro is a political administrative capital of the country. It's
Hmm.
not a place where people live really. It's not a place where people are going to go watch football. They're usually, like civil servants or state functionaries, or
Right.
it's not people don't it's not, but Bouaké, yes, Bouaké needs a stadium. Abidjan needs probably one stadium. And what I like about the stadiums in San Pedro and Corhogo is that they're smaller establishment. They're, 20,000, 25,000 seaters. And you do want to have a stadium. You don't want to hyper centralize everything just in the capital or in the major cities. You want to have, a
Yeah.
20,000 seater in a place like Corhogo, which is in the extreme north of the country. And you don't want people up there to feel like they don't have the infrastructure that other cities have. So I don't mind those ones in particular because they're smaller. But I do think maybe uh, this extra one in Abidjan and maybe Yamoussoukro, I don't know if those are going to be really useful after the tournament, especially considering that since the Civil War, really, the Ivorian League has by and large been played in Abidjan. It's
Yeah. That
very
was my
rare for
next
teams to
question.
travel to
Yeah.
places, like at San Pedro or Corhogo or even in Bouaké, because football wasn't played there. That friendly that I was telling you about, where the national team played in Madagascar, was the first football match that was played there in years, 5, 6 years. So it became like a reliance on playing all your matches in Abidjan, and as a result, everything became hyper centralized, and that's still something that we're feeling the effects of until today. And so I don't know, like, yeah, the Yamoussoukro, the extra one in Abidjan, I'm not sure are necessary.
Yeah, and so that was going to be my next question because I had heard that as well, that all of the Abidjan, like, top Premier League of the championship is all played at one location, so it's centralized, which you can say in leagues that struggle financially, clubs that maybe might struggle with the logistics and the travel, that can be a benefit, but it's it appears pretty obvious that can have some effects of being too insulated, of lacking access to other areas within the country. But when you're in Abidjan, I know you've got an event coming up through an organization, a media publication that you're associated with called Africa as a Country. So could you tell us a little bit about that event, or let's step back and tell us about Africa as a Country and what that's all about, and then what you guys have planned for this event in Abidjan.
Yeah, Africa as a country really, Africa as a country is a collective really of like academics, journalists. It's a really cool team, and I got to be a part of the editorial committee for this AFCON. At least I'm going to be spearheading a lot of the coverage on that website. So if you're interested in what I've been saying, I highly recommend you go check the website out. We're going to be running previews of the tournament and pretty thorough coverage, and it's going to be coverage of really the tournament beyond the game. It's not really going to be heavily sporting
Mm-hmm.
analysis. So if that's your thing, maybe you go elsewhere. But if you want to know more about Ivory Coast as a country and some of the extra sporting things that are happening, then I highly recommend you check it out. And on January 16th in Abidjan at the Pic Villa Hotel, we're going to be having a watch party. On that day, the matches are going to be in Corhogo. So for the people that can't make the trip or don't want to make the trip, they're going to be able to come to this hotel, watch the matches. And at the same time, we're going to have, 3 or 4 panel talks about African football, one about the development of the women's game, one about, what this tournament means for the Ivory Coast as a country, and one about how African football unites the continent. So I think it's going to be a thing where you can maybe meet other journalists, maybe meet some former players who are pretty well known.
Mm-hmm.
Watch the matches. If you feel like eating, you can eat. And I think it's one of those events that you don't really have at a Euros or a Copa America, but we're also tight on the African continent. There's such a jovial and intimate and family atmosphere that we have. We try to have events like this almost at every tournament.
That's awesome. That sounds like a great way to, as you mentioned, see beyond just the field, right? See beyond what's happening, especially, like for me, from my perspective, being an English speaker, we talked about this a little bit. It can be difficult to find a lot of information on French West Africa or a lot of other areas of Africa that are not necessarily putting out a lot of information in English. So, I'm really looking forward to this, really hoping to be able to make that event and be able to connect with people too. Beyond the AFCON, if people want to follow your work, can you tell us a little bit more about your podcast and maybe where the best place to keep an eye on all of your upcoming pieces and stories?
Yeah, so I've started a new podcast. It's just been a few months now. I'm very happy with a lot of the traction and response we've been receiving over our AFCON previews. The podcast is called the African Five-A-Side Podcast. We tend to, as I was saying earlier about Africa as a country, we try to go beyond, the X's and O's and try to speak about political, social, economic issues within the African football game, within the African game in football. Um, Besides that, for this tournament, I'm going to be contributing to Al Jazeera English, so you can find some of my coverage there. Um, I'm most probably going to be doing social media work for Copa 90 on TikTok, on
Okay.
Instagram, and on Twitter as well. And I'm also going to be writing on africasacountry.com and producing my own podcast as well. So that's where you can find all of my work. And also on also going to be doing some radio for the BBC. So these tend to be very busy tournaments for me. And if you really want to find, any and all of that in one place, you could just follow me on Twitter. It's
Awesome.
at Mezahi, which is my last name, and then Maher, which is my first name, at Mezahi Maher.
Cool. So I'll definitely throw those links up, and everybody. So what I'm hearing then is pretty much anywhere you're going for news in the English speaking world, you're probably going to see Maher's work, which we look forward to. But yeah, man, thank you so much for meeting with us. The way that we end each podcast, I'd love to get your answer here. Could you finish the sentence because football?
Because football means so much to me, I've made it my life's mission to tell as many stories as I can in African football.
That's solid, man. Very
As,
well done. Right on the
as
spot. I
usual,
love
I
putting
fancy
people on the
myself.
spot. So you can sink or swim, and you swam there. So well done. And thank you, Maher, so much for your time. We know it's you're rushing, getting ready to fly off to Cote d'Ivoire, and we look forward to seeing more there. But we really appreciate it. And for everybody watching, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Andrew.